the global tariff war that was launched by Donald Trump. Canada has just announced a series of retaliatory measures, including 25% tariffs on a variety of American goods.
When steel prices explode, energy costs spike, and automakers collapse, all in the same week when a quiet neighbor makes one move and sends your entire economy into freefall. That's exactly what just happened. Canada just wiped out $302 billion from the U.S. auto industry overnight. This isn't a trade dispute, it's a full-blown economic ambush. This was a calculated strike, and the U.S. never saw it coming. But here's the real shock. Canada's been planning this for years, and they're just getting started. So how did we get here? Can America recover, or is this the beginning of a much bigger collapse? Canada's breaking point. Trade tensions between the United States and Canada simmered beneath the surface for decades. While public speeches praised friendship and cooperation, behind closed doors, Canadian officials grew increasingly frustrated with what they saw as one-sided policies. Donald Trump imposed tariffs under the guise of national security, targeting Canadian steel and aluminum in particular. The move sent a strong message. American interests come first, even at the expense of its oldest allies. At first, Canada played it cool. They responded diplomatically, attempting to resolve disputes through negotiation. But the pattern kept repeating. More tariffs, more restrictions, more economic pressure on Canadian industries. Time and time again, the United States took actions that prioritized domestic political wins over economic balance. For Canadian leaders, each round of unfair trade practices felt like another slap in the face. When the United States doubled down with tariffs in the early 2020s, Canada's patience snapped. They had warned Washington repeatedly that there were limits to what they could tolerate. And when the latest round of protectionist measures rolled out, it was the final straw. What followed wasn't just a countermeasure, it was a message. Canada decided it would no longer play second fiddle in North American trade. The decision to impose a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum exports, along with a 10% surcharge on energy, was months in the making. Canadian officials had quietly analyzed the most vulnerable pressure points in the United States economy, and they found them. The goal wasn't just to hit back, it was to prove that Canada could strike back hard enough to cause real pain. In a sense, this was a revolt years in the making. Not a spontaneous explosion of outrage, but a strategic reset born from years of unequal treatment. Washington underestimated just how serious Canada had become. And now the fallout was being felt across every factory floor in the American heartland. Assembly lines in crisis. Within days of the Canadian tariffs going into effect, the auto industry was thrown into chaos. Plants that had relied on the steady flow of Canadian steel found themselves scrambling to source alternative materials, often at much higher costs. Some automakers considered switching to domestic suppliers, but they were either too expensive, too slow, or already overbooked. Others turned to offshore options, only to face longer shipping times and greater uncertainty. The results were devastating. Production schedules were ripped apart. Supply chains, already strained from the global pandemic and semiconductor shortages, buckled under the new pressure. Assembly lines slowed to a crawl. In some cases, plants were forced to halt production entirely. Layoffs began to ripple through factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Texas. Thousands of workers found themselves suddenly out of a job or working reduced hours. And with labor already tight, the disruptions couldn't have come at a worse time. Tesla was among the hardest hit. The company's dependence on high-grade aluminum and nickel, much of it sourced from Canada, meant their electric vehicle production faced immediate setbacks. The timing was especially brutal, as Tesla had just begun scaling its Cybertruck production and expanding operations in Texas and Germany. The cost of building an EV surged overnight, threatening Tesla's plans to bring more affordable models to market. Worse still, automakers faced a critical dilemma: either absorb the new costs and suffer shrinking profit margins, or pass them on to consumers and risk collapsing demand. Neither option was good. In fact, many companies tried to do both, cutting back on capital investments while slowly raising prices on vehicles, parts, and services. America's industrial machine was seizing up. The gears that once turned smoothly across the US-Canada border were now grinding against a system buckling under pressure. And the chaos was not confined to assembly lines. It was beginning to seep into every corner of the economy. The contagion. The U.S. auto industry might have been the first to feel the blow, but it wasn't alone. From logistics to small business to everyday consumers, the effects of Canada's economic counterstrike spread like wildfire. Suppliers that made everything from seatbelt components to dashboard electronics found themselves stuck. Materials were either too expensive to import or entirely unavailable on time. Transport companies suddenly had fewer contracts to fulfill as automakers cut back on parts orders and vehicle shipments. And it didn't stop there. Warehouses, tool shops, and packaging firms that served automotive plants also saw demand fall through the floor. Some laid off workers. Others shut down entirely. Retailers began to feel the pressure too. With fewer new vehicles rolling off the lot, used car prices surged again. Leasing companies raised rates. Auto repair shops couldn't find parts. Dealerships delayed orders and canceled upgrades. Consumer confidence started to wobble as the realization set in. Everything from car insurance to financing was about to get more expensive. Meanwhile, energy costs were creeping into unrelated sectors. Manufacturing plants outside of automotive, such as those producing appliances, construction equipment, or even canned food, faced higher electricity and fuel bills. Many were forced to raise prices to stay afloat. For American families already stretched thin by inflation, this was insult to injury. A trade war few had followed in the news was suddenly making groceries, gas, and daily life more expensive. The United States economy had been caught in a complex web of interdependence with Canada. That web just snapped, and as each strand gave way, the entire structure trembled. But here's where it gets even more serious. This was only the beginning, because while the auto industry was the first domino, Canada had more moves up its sleeve. And Washington still didn't know how deep this strategy went. Canada pulls the plug. Most Americans have no idea that a large portion of their electricity doesn't come from within their own borders. For decades, the United States quietly depended on Canada for reliable, low-cost power, especially in key states like New York, Michigan, and California. Every day, thousands of megawatts of hydroelectric energy have flowed south from Quebec and Ontario, lighting homes, powering factories, and keeping winter heating bills under control. But now that steady current is facing disruption, and the consequences could be catastrophic. At the heart of this storm is hydroelectricity. Canada is a global leader in hydropower, with provinces like Quebec and British Columbia exporting vast amounts of electricity through cross-border transmission lines. It's clean, it's cheap, and until recently, it was considered stable. But with trade tensions escalating and the United States imposing aggressive tariffs, Canadian leaders are reassessing their priorities. Ontario Premier Doug Ford shocked observers when he floated the possibility of cutting off electricity exports to the United States altogether. That was not an empty threat. It was a warning shot. The threat of restricted energy exports has already sent shockwaves through American energy markets. Utilities in northern states are scrambling to find alternative sources of electricity, and prices are beginning to reflect that panic. A household in Michigan that once paid $150 a month for electricity could soon be looking at bills closer to $250. And the worst part, the infrastructure to replace Canadian hydro doesn't exist. Not yet, and not for years to come. This energy crisis isn't just about higher bills. It's about grid stability. During extreme weather events, like polar vortexes or summer heat waves, Canadian electricity often fills the gaps in the U.S. grid. Without it, blackouts become far more likely. And when factories lose power or homes go dark in the dead of winter, the consequences move from economic to life-threatening. Canada's electricity might have been silent, invisible, and taken for granted, but it was essential. And now, as Canada flexes its energy leverage, the United States is facing a power problem it cannot solve overnight. But electricity is only the beginning, because the next blow is coming for the future of American transportation itself. The EV revolution just hit a wall. Electric vehicles symbolize the future for years. Clean energy, quiet roads, independence from fossil fuels. And leading that charge was Tesla, America's flagship EV company. But while Elon Musk was unveiling futuristic prototypes and talking about Mars, a quieter, more pressing challenge was building behind the scenes. Canada isn't just an exporter of power. It is one of the world's most important sources of raw materials for electric vehicle batteries. We're talking about high-grade nickel, lithium, cobalt, and aluminum. Without those, an electric vehicle is just a hollow frame. And until recently, Canada was happy to supply these minerals to U.S. manufacturers. But with the trade war intensifying and tariffs flying, that relationship is unraveling. Tesla, Ford, and General Motors are already feeling the strain. Many of their battery supply chains depend on Canadian mining operations, especially for nickel and lithium, which are essential for long-range, high-performance EV batteries. These materials aren't just expensive, they're rare, and Canada produces some of the cleanest, highest quality reserves in the world. Losing access to them is like losing oxygen mid-run. But it's not just about scarcity, it's about timing. The global push toward EV adoption is accelerating, and automakers were already struggling to keep up. With Canadian exports now threatened or taxed at higher rates, manufacturers are facing a brutal decision: absorb massive material cost increases or scale back production goals. Neither option is sustainable, and as prices go up, the dream of affordable EVs for the average consumer starts to vanish. This couldn't come at a worse time. China is racing ahead with EV development and controls the majority of global battery processing infrastructure. With Canada potentially rerouting its critical minerals toward Asian partners, China's advantage grows even stronger. The United States, meanwhile, is left in a defensive position, reacting to global trends it no longer controls. Because while the United States is floundering, Canada is forging new paths, and the whole world is watching. Canada turns to Asia and Europe. Let's not forget, Canada's influence doesn't stop at hydropower and battery minerals. It is also sitting on vast reserves of natural gas, and for decades, most of it flowed south into the United States. The arrangement made sense. Pipelines were already built, the customer was close, the profits were steady. But once again, short-sighted U.S. trade policy has shifted the game. And this time, Canada isn't just fighting back, it's moving on. In the wake of U.S. tariffs and supply chain instability, Canada has made a strategic decision to turn east and west, away from Washington and toward Tokyo, Beijing, and Berlin. Massive investments in liquefied natural gas, or LNG, have enabled Canada to export its energy to global markets via ship, bypassing traditional US-bound pipelines entirely. One of the crown jewels of this shift is LNG Canada, a multi-billion-dollar export terminal on the Pacific coast. Once operational, it will allow Canadian gas to flow directly to Asia, supplying Japan, South Korea, and China with reliable energy. And they're not the only customers. Europe, desperately trying to wean itself off Russian fuel, is locking in contracts with Canadian suppliers for LNG shipments via Atlantic terminals. These are not small moves. We're talking about long-term, high-value agreements that represent a fundamental reorientation of Canada's economic future. The country is no longer relying on a single customer. It's diversifying, hedging, and capitalizing on global instability. In effect, Canada has become the world's energy middleman, a neutral, reliable supplier in a time of chaos. The irony: the United States, once the top recipient of Canadian energy, is now standing in line behind foreign buyers. And because liquefied natural gas is more flexible than pipelines, Canada can adjust its exports in real time, sending energy to wherever the price and political climate is most favorable. But this isn't a story of temporary retaliation. It's something bigger, because what Canada is doing right now isn't a reaction, it's a transformation. From friendly neighbor to strategic powerhouse. For most of modern history, Canada was seen as the United States' loyal junior partner, reliable, stable, and comfortably in America's economic shadow. But those days are over. What we're witnessing now is not just a trade dispute. It's a turning point in global power dynamics. Canada didn't get here by accident. This moment is the result of years of quiet investment, long-term strategy, and diplomatic discipline. While Washington chased short-term wins, Canada was building infrastructure, pipelines, ports, and power plants. It was also forging international relationships, striking trade deals with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and even China. All of that groundwork is now paying off. And it's not just about fossil fuels. Canada is also positioning itself as a leader in clean energy. With massive investments in hydro, wind, and nuclear power, it's creating an exportable green energy economy that aligns perfectly with Europe's climate goals. In fact, European nations have already begun signing energy pacts with Canada to secure stable, renewable power for decades to come. So, while the United States debates tariffs and plays catch-up, Canada is executing a vision. It's not about revenge anymore, it's about leadership. And the world is noticing. As Canada steps confidently into its new role, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just a bold move. It was the beginning of a new world order, and the United States is no longer at the center of it. Global trade just flipped, and the US is losing. While the United States was holding emergency meetings and playing political chess with its northern neighbor, China and India were already sealing deals. They saw the writing on the wall. Canada's pivot away from US trade dependence was not just a retaliatory measure. It was an open invitation to the rest of the world, and the East responded with urgency. China, for one, has wasted no time reinforcing its global energy dominance. Beijing's government has dramatically accelerated the stockpiling of critical resources, including crude oil, coal, and liquefied natural gas. Over the past 5 years, China has more than tripled its strategic energy reserves, preparing for any potential trade disruptions or economic warfare. When Canada began hinting at new energy alliances, China jumped into action, fast-tracking energy import terminals and infrastructure agreements that would reroute Canadian fuel straight into its expanding industrial ecosystem. India, on the other hand, has been facing its own energy storm. With surging demand and strained relationships with traditional suppliers in the Middle East and Russia, India found itself in desperate need of a reliable partner. Canada's energy-rich market and its willingness to negotiate long-term, stable contracts was the answer. As a result, India has signed multi-billion-dollar liquefied natural gas agreements with Canadian exporters, effectively creating a new energy lifeline for the subcontinent. For New Delhi, this isn't just about energy, it's about long-term economic security. What makes this more devastating for the United States is the sheer scale of what is being lost. For decades, American policymakers operated on the assumption that U.S. energy demand would always dictate global supply chains. That assumption no longer holds true. Canada's trade realignment is shifting the entire balance of energy influence from the West to the East. While Washington debates tariffs and trade restrictions, Asia is building supply routes, securing contracts, and locking in resources that will power their economies for decades to come. This isn't just about a few oil tankers or energy deals, it's about long-term strategy. The United States is losing its ability to set the terms of global trade. Countries like China and India are not only benefiting from Canada's realignment, they are shaping the new rules of commerce, and in doing so, they're weakening America's once unshakable economic position. But the most alarming part, this shift didn't happen in secret. Canada signaled its intention clearly. The United States simply failed to take them seriously. Now, America's former leverage, its economic centrality, its energy dominance, its ability to dictate trade policy, belongs to someone else. China and India moved faster, negotiated harder, and capitalized on a once-in-a-generation opening. And now, the global balance of power is tilting in their favor. But China and India aren't the only ones shifting their loyalties. Even America's closest allies are rethinking everything. U.S. allies are jumping ship. The United States relied on the unwavering loyalty of its traditional allies, Mexico to the south, Europe across the Atlantic, and Canada to the north. This triangle of trust was supposed to anchor the Western economy. But that trust is now unraveling. Take Mexico, for example. As a key partner in the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, Mexico has always played the middle ground, balancing trade relationships with both of its North American neighbors. But the ongoing trade war between Washington and Ottawa has put Mexico in a tight spot. On one hand, it wants to preserve its economic ties with the U.S. On the other, it cannot ignore the opportunities emerging from Canada's pivot to Asia and Europe. Recent signals from Mexican trade officials suggest that the country is quietly exploring closer energy and manufacturing partnerships with Canada, especially in areas where the United States has become unpredictable. Europe, meanwhile, is in panic mode. After cutting off Russian gas, European nations turned to North America for energy security. Initially, both the United States and Canada filled that void with LNG shipments and crude oil exports. But now, with Canada directing more of its energy to Asia and imposing tariffs that make U.S. energy production less competitive, European governments are scrambling. Germany, France, and the Netherlands have already begun renegotiating their energy deals, not with Washington, but with Ottawa. In fact, some European leaders are now openly questioning whether the United States can still be counted on as a stable trade partner. The European Union has also taken notice of Washington's internal divisions. Political gridlock, shifting regulatory frameworks, and an unstable trade strategy have made long-term deals with the U.S. increasingly risky. Instead of relying on American suppliers, many European nations are opting for more predictable partners, even if they are further away. Canada, with its abundant natural resources and steady political climate, is now viewed as the safer bet. The most telling sign? Infrastructure and procurement deals are changing hands. From steel and automotive parts to green technology and rare earth minerals, countries once deeply intertwined with the U.S. supply chain are now sourcing elsewhere. Canada, South Korea, Japan, and even India are stepping in to fill the gap. And it's not just governments making this shift. Corporations across Europe and Latin America are revising their sourcing strategy. International companies that once operated massive U.S.-centric supply chains are now investing in Canadian infrastructure, Asian ports, and alternative energy routes. The very structure of global commerce is being rewritten in real time. For the United States, this is a wake-up call of historic proportions. The erosion of trust is not temporary. If allies find that life without American trade dependence is not only possible but preferable, the U.S. may not get a second chance to rebuild those relationships, and the consequences go far beyond foreign policy. If the United States continues to isolate itself economically and diplomatically, it won't just lose trade deals. It will lose influence, credibility, and the ability to lead. But this growing isolation is only the beginning. The bigger crisis, the one unfolding on U.S. soil, is about to hit even harder. America's options. Too late to pivot. The United States is standing at an economic crossroads, and none of the available paths are smooth. With Canada accelerating its shift away from American dependence, Washington is now facing three painfully difficult options, each with steep costs, political risks, and long-term implications. Time, once its ally, is now its fiercest enemy. The first option, rebuild ties with Canada. This would mean rolling back tariffs, easing trade restrictions, and essentially admitting that the previous hardline stance backfired. It would require humility and diplomacy at a moment when American politics is deeply divided, but it is also the most direct and potentially effective solution. By re-establishing the energy and materials trade flow from Canada, the United States could stabilize auto production, secure key battery components for electric vehicles, and bring down costs for manufacturers and consumers alike. However, there is a catch. Canada may no longer be interested. With new billion-dollar contracts being signed across Europe and Asia, Canada is no longer in a position of need. They have options now, and the longer the United States delays, the harder it becomes to regain priority access. The second option is ramping up domestic energy production. On paper, this sounds like a patriotic solution. Drill more oil, mine more nickel, and build out refineries and processing centers. But the timeline is brutal. Even under the most optimistic projections, opening new oil and gas fields or launching domestic lithium operations takes years. Add in environmental regulations, community resistance, and labor shortages, and this plan starts to look like a logistical nightmare. Worse, some of America's shale oil reserves are already declining, and much of its untapped land lacks the infrastructure to support rapid development. So while this option could work in the long term, it offers no immediate relief. Meanwhile, consumers and manufacturers continue to suffer in the short term. The third option is the most transformative and the most difficult: a full-scale investment into renewables and nuclear energy. This would mean embracing a green future, accelerating wind and solar deployment, and pouring resources into next-generation nuclear reactors, like small modular reactors. On the surface, this aligns with climate goals and long-term sustainability, but in practice, the clean energy transition is a marathon, not a sprint. Solar panels, wind turbines, and nuclear plants require years of planning, zoning, materials, and skilled labor to deploy. And ironically, many of the raw materials needed for this shift, lithium, cobalt, nickel, are still controlled by foreign suppliers, including Canada and China. So even this bold path requires geopolitical coordination that the current administration may struggle to pull off quickly. What we're witnessing is a full-blown economic revolt, not in the form of protests or riots, but in votes, in purchases, in lost trust. Workers are voting with their time, taking early retirements or changing industries. Voters are switching parties or staying home on election day. Shoppers are choosing alternative brands, alternative sources, or opting out altogether. The damage isn't just economic, it's emotional. And once a population feels betrayed, it rarely forgets. The question now is whether the U.S. government will catch up to the mood of its own people, because this isn't just about retooling trade policy. It's about restoring confidence, trust in leadership, trust in economic stability, trust that a better solution is still possible. But time is running out. The U.S. may still have cards to play, but the world has changed, and not everyone is waiting for America to catch up. This isn't just about Canada. It's about whether the United States can still lead in a world that's moving on without it. So what do you think? Can Washington repair the damage in time, or is this the beginning of something much bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments.